A king who ruled for a decade spent only 6 months in his own kingdom. The rest of the time, he bled, conquered, and burned on foreign soil for glory, and for his own insatiable ambition. On an evening in April 1199, candlelight flickered in a humble tent, the air thick with the scent of blood and damp fabric. There lay Europe's greatest warrior, felled by an arrow from an unknown soldier, not in a glorious battle, but during a siege launched for a treasure that might not even exist. For the next 3 hours, we trace the complete life of Richard, from the overlooked third son to the legendary Crusader, to his death in the most absurd of places. He won almost every battle, yet lost the entire war. He left behind the most resounding reputation in Europe, along with a kingdom that had been hollowed out. How did this conflict arise? More importantly, are each of us repeating the same mistakes in our work, family, and life choices? This is a story you can listen to while working, commuting, or slowly unwinding at night. Now, let time rewind. The 8th of September, 1157, Oxford, England. A boy was born and named Richard. He was the third son of King Henry II. In the Middle Ages, this meant his fate was sealed. The eldest, Henry, would inherit the throne, the second, Geoffrey, would receive Brittany, and Richard, at best, would be granted a dukedom. No one expected him to become king. His mother Eleanor did not see it that way. This woman, once the Queen of France and later married to the King of England, held the Duchy of Aquitaine, nearly a third of southern France, in Richard. She saw a certain quality, not the sense of responsibility of the eldest, nor the tact of the second, but pure willpower. Richard was sent to Aquitaine at the age of 9. There, he learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, archery, and most importantly, warfare. The nobles of Aquitaine were unruly and frequently rebelled. As a young boy, Richard followed his mother's generals to quell one rebellion after another. The sound of horse hooves, trampling the earth, and the clang of armor became the soundtrack of his childhood. At 15, he commanded his first battle independently. The enemy was a group of rebellious Aquitaine nobles, holding a fortified castle. Richard did not opt for a lengthy siege observing the terrain. He discovered the castle's water source was outside. He cut off the water supply, and the castle surrendered 3 days later. This was not brute force, it was calculation. Perhaps this was the first lesson. Being the third son taught you one thing. If you want anything, you have to fight for it. But Richard's greatest enemy was not the rebels of Aquitaine, but his own father. Henry II wanted to control everything, including his sons. He gave them titles, but withheld real power. Though Richard was nominally the Duke of Aquitaine, the actual decision-making authority remained in his father's hands. The young Richard could not In 1173-16 year, old Richard made his first major life decision, to rebel against his father. He was not alone. His 2 older brothers joined him. Their mother, Eleanor, secretly supported them. Even King Louis VII of France stood on their side. This was not a simple family dispute. It was a civil war that tore the empire apart. The war lasted for a year and a half. The castle changed hands. Allies betrayed, and farmlands were burned. Richard learned the harsh realities of medieval warfare. There was no glory, only mud, hunger, and betrayal. In the end, his father won the war with greater resources and experience. Richard was forced to sue for peace, kneeling before his father to beg for forgiveness. However, Henry II made a mistake. He forgave his sons but imprisoned his wife, Eleanor. He confined her in Windsor Castle for 16 years. Richard would never forgive his father for this. This hatred would erupt 16 years later, destroying everything Henry II had built. After the peace agreement, Richard returned to Aquitaine. For the next 15 years, he did one thing: fight. He quelled rebellions, one after another. He besieged castles, one after another. His tactics were simple and effective, swift, fierce, and merciless. If the enemy surrendered, he showed mercy. If they resisted, he destroyed everything. He had almost never been defeated on the battlefield. By the late 1180s, the nobles of Aquitaine had learned one thing: do not provoke Richard. His reputation spread across Europe: brave, ruthless, almost invincible. He earned a nickname, Lionheart. This name would follow him for a lifetime, and even 800 years after his death, it would still be remembered. But reputation is a double-edged sword. It gave him an advantage, yet it also imprisoned him. The stronger he became, the greater the price, because each victory made it harder for him to turn back. And at that time, his father was still alive and ruling. What about his brothers? The eldest, Henry, died of dysentery in 1183. The second, Geoffrey, died in a tournament accident in 1186. Suddenly, Richard became the heir. In 1189, Richard was 32 years old. He had grown impatient, waiting to inherit the throne. To make matters worse, he heard rumors that his father intended to make his youngest son John the heir. Richard could not accept this. He had fought for 15 years and built his reputation. Was he now to be replaced by a brother who had done nothing? He chose rebellion once again, but this time was different. This time, he found a new ally, King Philip II of France, a young, intelligent, and ambitious ruler. Philip wanted to weaken England, and Richard wanted the throne. Their interests aligned, so in the summer of 1189 they joined forces to attack Henry III. The war was brief. Henry II, at 56, was weary, ill, and shattered by his son's betrayal. His armies surrendered, one after another. His allies deserted him one by one. In the end, he was forced to sue for peace under humiliating terms. When he saw the list of traitors on the surrender document, he found the name of his youngest son, John Even. His most beloved son had betrayed him. A few days later, Henry II died. His last words were said to be, "Let everything go with me." Richard had won the throne, but at the cost of his father's life. Would this haunt him? History does not record it. We only know that he immediately began preparing for what he truly wanted to do, the Crusade. The 3rd of September, 1189, Westminster Abbey. Richard I was crowned King of England. The church echoed with hymns, and censers filled the air with the scent of frankincense. But Richard's mind was elsewhere. His gaze was already fixed on the East Jerusalem, the holy city of Christianity, which had been captured 2 years earlier by the Muslim leader Saladin. At his coronation, Richard made a vow. He would join the Third Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. All of England cheered. But they did not know what this meant. It meant the king would leave, be gone for a long time, and spend every coin in the treasury. Richard immediately began raising funds. He sold everything that could be sold: offices, titles, lands, judicial rights. He is said to have joked, "If I could find a buyer, I would sell London itself." He imposed a new tax called the Saladin tithe, 1/10 of everyone's income. England had never been taxed like this before. Just 4 months later, in December 1189, Richard left England. He entrusted the kingdom to his trusted ministers. He left behind his brother John. Though he did not trust him, he set off for France and then to the Holy Land. He would stay there for 3 years. What would happen in England during those 3 years? Richard did not care much. He had a war to fight. Now in December 1189, Richard left England. He headed east, toward glory, toward what he believed was his destiny. He did not know what awaited him: victory and defeat, honor and disgrace, legend and death. But one thing was certain: he would fight, because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and the only thing that would destroy him. In 1190, Richard's fleet departed from the European coast. The sails billowed in the Mediterranean winds, the wooden ships creaked, and the sound of waves crashing against the hull echoed day and night. This was not a swift expedition, but a grueling journey that lasted for months. From Marseille in France to Sicily, from Sicily to Cyprus, and from Cyprus to the Holy Land. Yet, Richard did not know at the time that the glory brought by this journey was, with every step, draining his future as a king. The first stop was Sicily. Richard's sister Joanna had married the king of Sicily. But the king died, and the new king, Tancred, detained Joanna along with her dowry. Richard could not tolerate such an insult. Instead of engaging in diplomatic negotiations, he directly laid siege to the city of Messina in just 5 days. The city surrendered. He reclaimed his sister and her dowry, and also secured a substantial compensation. But this small victory sowed the seeds of future problems. While wintering in Sicily, Richard's relationship with King Philip of France began to deteriorate. The two had once been allies, even friends. Yet now, Philip envied Richard's success, while Richard scorned Philip's caution. A rift began to form. In the spring of 1191, Richard's fleet continued eastward. Along the way, they encountered a storm, and several ships were blown to the island of Cyprus. The local ruler, Isaac Comnenos, seized the crew and cargo. Richard's response was swift and fierce. He landed on Cyprus and conquered the entire island in less than 3 weeks. The conquest of Cyprus showcased Richard's military genius. By combining naval and land forces and employing rapid maneuver tactics, he seized key strongholds before the enemy could react. Isaac surrendered and was imprisoned with silver chains because Richard had promised not to bind him with iron. This was Richard's brand of dark humor. In June 1191, Richard finally arrived at Acre. The port city had been under siege by the Crusaders for 2 years. King Philip of France was already there. Thousands of Crusader soldiers were camped outside the city walls. But they had made no progress. The city was strong. Its defenders were tenacious, and Saladin's reinforcements were nearby. Richard's arrival changed everything. He brought new siege weapons, including massive catapults. He reorganized the siege, attacking the walls day and night without pause. He stood at the front lines himself, supervising and inspiring the soldiers. The thunderous roar of stones striking the walls, the shouts of soldiers, and the groans of the wounded blended into a symphony of war. Just 1 month later, on the 12th of July, 1191, Acre surrendered. This was a major victory for the Crusaders. The city returned to Christian control, and its port could supply further operations. However, the terms of surrender sowed the seeds of tragedy. The garrison would be released on the condition that Saladin pay a ransom, return the relic of the true cross, and free Christian prisoners. After the fall of Acre, the rifts within the Crusader ranks could no longer be concealed. King Philip of France announced his intention to return to France, citing illness as the reason. The real cause, he could no longer bear living in Richard's shadow. Everyone spoke of Richard's bravery, Richard's tactics, Richard's victories. Philip had been sidelined. In August 1191, Philip departed the Holy Land with his army. This was both good and bad news for Richard. The good news, he was now the undisputed leader of the Crusade. The bad news, what would Philip do upon returning to France? Richard knew the answer. Philip would attack his territories in France. Yet, Richard chose to stay. Jerusalem lay ahead, and glory called. At this moment, the darkest event of Richard's life occurred. Saladin failed to pay the ransom on time. Richard waited for several weeks. Growing increasingly impatient, his army wanted to march south and attack, but the 2,700 Muslim prisoners would be a burden. Richard made a decision: execute all the prisoners. This is a war crime with no room for justification. Richard could have chosen to leave a garrison to guard the prisoners, could have waited longer, or could have pursued other options. Yet he chose the most brutal method. This stain will forever tarnish his legacy. In late August 1191, Richard's army marched south along the coast, aiming for Jaffa and then Jerusalem. It was a grueling journey under the scorching sun and through dusty terrain. The soldiers advanced in heavy armor under intense heat. Supplies were provided by the fleet at sea, but Saladin's cavalry continuously harassed their flanks. On the 7th of September, at Arsuf, Saladin launched a decisive attack. Muslim cavalry charged from all directions, with war drums thundering and arrows falling like rain. Richard's strategy was to wait. He ordered his troops to maintain their formation and refrain from counterattacking, enduring even under fierce assault. He was waiting for the perfect moment. When the Muslim cavalry grew weary from their prolonged charge, Richard ordered a counterattack. The Crusader heavy cavalry surged forth from their formation, crashing into the enemy like a torrent of steel. Saladin's forces were scattered and forced to retreat. The Battle of Arsuf marked a significant victory for the Crusaders and showcased Richard's peak as a master tactician. After the victory, Richard continued southward, capturing Jaffa. Now, Jerusalem was within reach. On the map, it was only a few days' journey from Jaffa to the Holy City. Richard's army was in high spirits, with everyone anticipating the ultimate victory, retaking Jerusalem and fulfilling the Crusaders' mission. But Richard hesitated. He convened a military council to assess the situation. The problem was clear. Even if Jerusalem were captured, how could it be held? The city was inland, far from any port, making supply difficult. Saladin's army would lay siege to it. Once the Crusaders completed their pilgrimage, they would return to Europe. Who would be left to defend it? Richard advanced 3 times to within sight of Jerusalem, only to retreat on each occasion, with every withdrawal. The soldiers' disappointment grew deeper. They could not understand why he did not attack. But Richard knew. Capturing a city that could not be held was not victory, but vanity. It was one of his rare moments of rationality. Yet, it also earned him the enduring label of the one who failed to retake Jerusalem. In 1192, Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa. Richard was not in the city at the time. When he received the news, Jaffa was on the verge of falling. Richard did something insane. He rushed to Jaffa by sea with only a handful of knights. They leaped directly from their ships into the water and charged through the waves toward the beach. Richard and his 80 knights charged into the city, driving back thousands of Muslim soldiers. It seemed nearly impossible. Yet Richard's presence shifted the balance of morale. The defenders regrouped and successfully counterattacked. Jaffa was saved. This stands as one of Richard's most legendary moments, showcasing sheer courage and leadership. A few days later, Saladin attacked once more. Richard led a mere 2,000 men with fewer than 100 knights. Facing Saladin's thousands of cavalry, the battle lasted an entire day. Richard fought on the front lines. His mount was shot down twice, and he himself narrowly escaped death on multiple occasions. Yet he held his ground. In the end, Saladin withdrew. But Richard also knew this was unsustainable. He was ill, his army was exhausted, and supplies were insufficient. More importantly, bad news came from France. Philip and his brother John were conspiring to seize his territories. Richard had to make a choice: stay in the Holy Land pursuing an illusory complete victory, or return to defend his kingdom. In September 1192, Richard reached a peace agreement with Saladin. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were granted free access to the holy sites. The Crusaders retained control of the coastal cities. It was a compromise, not a victory. Yet, it was the best outcome Richard could secure. In October 1192, Richard left the Holy Land. He had not recaptured Jerusalem, a failure that would forever haunt his legacy. Yet, he had accomplished other things. preserving the Crusaders' foothold in the Holy Land, demonstrating unparalleled military prowess, and building a legendary reputation, but at what cost? A neglected kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse, and he had not yet paid the final price for it. On the third day after the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, Richard sat in his tent in Jaffa, listening to the casualty report. The Crusaders had lost 412 men, while the Muslims had suffered even greater losses. By any measure, it was a brilliant victory. Yet there was no joy on Richard's face. He dismissed the messenger and sat alone, his gaze fixed on Jerusalem on the map. Victory should feel better. This had been the pattern of Richard's life. Fight, win, celebrate, move on. But this time was different. Perhaps it was because he was 34 now, no longer the young man who had fought in Aquitaine. Perhaps it was the malaria from the Holy Land that had weakened his body. Or perhaps it was because he was beginning to realize that no matter how many battles he won, Jerusalem remained there out of reach. Outside the tent came the sounds of soldiers celebrating. Laughter, singing, the clinking of wine cups. They should celebrate, Richard thought. But they were also starting to ask questions. When would they attack Jerusalem? When would they go home? How much longer would they stay here? Richard had no answers, and that unsettled him more than any defeat. In January 1192, Richard stood for the first time on a hill overlooking Jerusalem. The golden domes of the Holy City shimmered in the winter sunlight, heartbreakingly beautiful. His Crusaders cheered, some wept. They had marched thousands of kilometers from Europe, fought for 2 years, and now at last they beheld the sacred city. Yet, they did not know that this was the closest they would ever come to their goal. The moment when their dream began to crumble. Richard's military advisors gathered around him, urging an attack. Morale was high. Saladin's forces were weary, and the timing seemed perfect. Richard silently studied the map. From here to Jerusalem, 2 days' march. The city's defenders were few. Taking it was entirely feasible militarily, but his mind was calculating a deeper problem: how to hold it after the conquest. Richard raised a harsh reality. The city was inland, far from any port. Saladin would lay siege. Supplies would be difficult. More crucially, how many Crusaders were willing to stay and defend the city? The council chamber fell silent. No one answered. Because the answer was obvious. Once the pilgrimage was complete, most would go home. No one wanted to stay in the Holy Land forever. Capturing a city that could not be held was not victory. It was vanity. Richard turned and walked away from the hill. The soldiers did not understand. They watched their king turn his back on the holy city, and their confusion turned to disappointment. Disappointment to murmurs. The chronicles record the whispers in the camp. Some questioned his courage, others doubted his motives, and some began to complain openly. Richard heard these voices, each one cut like a knife. But he kept walking, because he knew his judgment was right, even if it was unpopular. In March 1192, a ship arrived from England bringing a pile of letters. Richard unfolded the first one, recognizing his mother Eleanor as handwriting. Shaky but clear, at 70 years old, she was still managing the kingdom for him. The contents of the letter made Richard's heart sink. The treasury was empty. The people were complaining. The nobles were questioning his rule. And worst of all, John was gathering allies and buying castles. Eleanor wrote at the end that she didn't know how much longer she could hold on, and Richard must return. The second letter, from the chief minister, was more detailed and even more grim. The new taxes had sparked minor rebellions. The forced surrender of church silverware had caused protests. Merchants were going bankrupt. Peasants were abandoning their land, and John was secretly promising, if Richard were to meet an accidental death in the Holy Land, The nobles who supported him would be richly rewarded. This was not just a threat of betrayal, but an open political maneuver. Richard felt a wave of dizziness. It wasn't a bout of malaria, but the shock of realization. While he pursued glory in the Holy Land, his kingdom was crumbling. What had the Crusade given him? Acre, yes, a few coastal cities, yes. But Jerusalem remained out of reach, and the cost. His lands in France were under attack by Philip. England was being eroded bit by John. The treasury was drained, and the loyalty of his people was overextended. The accounts simply did not add up. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth in his tent, pondering his situation. 3 years ago, he had been one of the most powerful kings in Europe, ruling an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Now he was in the Holy Land, thousands of kilometers from home, and his empire was crumbling. He had sacrificed almost everything he could for a goal that might never be achieved. He thought of his father, Henry II. The old king never stayed away from his domains for too long. For he understood the nature of power. It requires presence, constant attention. Power is not something you win once and keep forever. It is something you must maintain every day. Richard now understood this lesson, but the understanding had come too late. 3 years of absence had caused damage that might be irreparable. Richard opened a small chest containing the personal items he had brought with him when he left England. Inside were a ring from his mother, letters from his wife Berengaria, and a small painting of an English landscape. He gazed at the painting. Green fields, a grey sky, a stone castle. That should have been home, though he had only spent a few months there. But what was home? England was almost foreign. France was a battlefield, and Aquitaine was a childhood memory. He was an eternal traveler, a perpetual soldier, yet he never truly belonged anywhere. In June 1192, Richard refused to attack Jerusalem for the second time. The reaction in the camp was even stronger this time. Some crusaders openly questioned his decision. Rumors began to spread. Some said he had been bribed by Saladin. Others claimed he had lost his courage. And the most hurtful accusation was that he never cared about Jerusalem, only his own glory. These allegations were baseless, but they found fertile ground among the disappointed army. A veteran who had followed Richard from France requested an audience. He had fought in every battle, his armor dented and his face scarred. He voiced a question on many soldiers' minds: 3 years of fighting, countless sacrifices, enduring hunger, disease, and scorching heat, only to gaze upon Jerusalem and then turn away. Would their fallen comrades have died in vain? Richard tried to explain the strategic considerations, supply lines, long-term defense, realistic military possibilities. But the veteran shook his head and walked away. He represented not strategic thinking, but the simple logic of a soldier. They came here for a purpose, to liberate the holy city. If that mission remained unfulfilled, then everything lost its meaning. Richard let him go, knowing the chasm between them could not be bridged. Strategists and warriors lived in two different worlds. From that day on, the atmosphere in the camp changed. The soldiers still followed orders, but the look of worship and awe in their eyes was gone. In its place were confusion, disappointment, and even a hint of resentment. The legend of the Lionheart faded in the dust of the Holy Land. Richard felt this change, and it pained him more than any defeat. Malaria struck again and again, each time leaving Richard weak for days. High fevers, chills, and hallucinations became part of his life. The army doctor said it was the price of the Holy Land. Almost every crusader contracted malaria. Some died from it, and those who survived were plagued by it for life. Richard survived. But each attack took a piece of his strength, slowly eroding the body that once seemed indestructible. The man in the mirror was almost unrecognizable to Richard. When he left England 3 years ago, he was a robust 32-year-old warrior, with flowing blonde hair and brimming with vitality. Now, the reflection showed a weary 35-year-old man, his hair streaked with gray, deep wrinkles around his eyes, and his body gaunt from illness. The Holy Land was consuming him, just as it had devoured countless crusaders. The cost of war was not only those who died on the battlefield, but also those who returned alive, yet were no longer themselves. His fighting style is also changing. He used to always charge at the front, the first to attack and the last to retreat. Now he is more cautious, not out of fear, but because his body reminds him, "You are no longer 20. Wounds take longer to heal. A day of fighting requires 2 days of recovery." He is still brave, but that courage is now mixed with a real awareness of death and a sober understanding of his physical limitations. After the Battle of Jaffa in August 1192, Richard received a private letter from Saladin. It was not an official diplomatic document, but a personal communication from one warrior to another. Saladin wrote that he respected Richard as an opponent, but also observed the toll the Holy Land had taken on him: illness, exhaustion, disappointment. This land was killing soldiers on both sides. Perhaps it was time for peace talks. The tone of the letter was not one of a victor's arrogance, but rather the understanding of an equally weary warrior. Richard read the letter over and over. Every word Saladin said was true. The Holy Land was killing them both, not just physically, but spiritually. Richard had come here filled with idealism and religious fervor. Now he felt only weariness and doubt about everything. What was the best outcome of continuing to fight? Capturing Jerusalem for a few months only to lose it again? Sacrificing more lives for a symbolic victory? Was it worth it? Richard began drafting a reply, a tentative opening for peace talks. Then he paused his pen. What would the Crusaders think if he started peace talks now? What would the Pope think? What would the entire Christian world think? They would say the Lionheart had failed, betrayed his mission. But another voice in his mind asked, what if the fight continued to a meaningless end, to avoid being called a failure? More people would die. How does that add up? During those weeks, Richard did something he rarely did. He visited the camps and spoke with the common soldiers. It wasn't for inspection or to give orders, but to listen to their stories. The son of a farmer from Yorkshire who joined the army to escape poverty. A French knight whose family had served the Plantagenets for generations. An Italian merchant who saw a business opportunity. Each had their own reasons for coming to the Holy Land, and most of those reasons had little to do with religious ideals. The soldiers' confessions shocked Richard. Most of them didn't care about Jerusalem. They were there because they were ordered, because of pressure from the church, or for the pay. The Holy City was just another city to them. What they truly wanted was to go home. This realization shook Richard's understanding of the entire crusade. If the soldiers themselves didn't believe in the mission, what was the point of this war? Who was he fighting for, and why? Richard visited the medical tent. Hundreds of patients lay there. Malaria, dysentery, infected wounds, various fevers. Medieval medicine had little to offer against these ailments. He watched young men die in agony, saw soldiers with amputated limbs, and witnessed bodies ravaged by disease. This was the other side of war. Not the glorious charges and brilliant victories, but the slow, silent decay. A dying young soldier recognized Richard. There was fear in his eyes. Fear of dying in this strange place, far from home and loved ones. Richard held his hand until the young man's breathing ceased. That night, Richard wept in his tent. not for his own failure, but for all those who had given their lives for his dream. For those who believed, he would lead them to glory only to find sickness and death. In early September 1192, another urgent letter arrived from England. Richard's most trusted minister reported that the situation had reached a critical breaking point. Philip had captured 3 important castles in Normandy. John no longer concealed his ambitions, openly declaring that he would be a better king if Richard died in the Holy Land. Worse still, there was clear evidence that Philip and John were conspiring together. If Richard did not return immediately, he could lose everything. Richard gathered his remaining loyal advisors. He passed the letter around for them to read. The situation was clear. He had to decide between 2 choices. Stay in the Holy Land, continue the pursuit of Jerusalem, with success uncertain, or return immediately to defend his kingdom. He could not have both. Time, distance, and resources would not allow it. This was not just a military decision, but a defining moment for the meaning of his entire reign. A seasoned old general spoke. His advice was cold, but rational. Jerusalem had waited 90 years. It could wait a little longer. But the kingdom could not. Philip would not stop. John would not stop. If Richard lost England and Normandy, he would be nothing. A king without a kingdom cannot launch a crusade. The other advisors nodded. It was the voice of reason, but Richard listened with a deep sorrow. Richard calmly stated the fact that everyone knew but no one wanted to admit. They had failed. The Third Crusade had not retaken Jerusalem. It was a failure, no matter how many minor victories were used to gloss over it. They could list achievements: Acre, the coastal cities, multiple victories over Saladin. But these were not Jerusalem. The mission was unfulfilled. No one contradicted him, for it was an undeniable truth. Over the next 2 weeks, messengers frequently traveled between Richard and Saladin, finalizing every detail of the peace agreement. The negotiations were difficult, with neither side willing to yield on key issues. Yet both understood that this had to end. Saladin's army was equally exhausted, and his treasury was just as depleted. Both empires were bleeding and needed time to recover. Weariness became the most powerful driving force for peace. The terms of the final agreement reflected a compromise between both parties. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christians were permitted to make pilgrimages freely and without arms. The Crusaders retained Acre and other coastal cities as permanent strongholds. The truce was precisely set for 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. A testament to the medieval diplomatic obsession with numerical symbolism. When Richard signed the agreement, his hand did not tremble. He had fully accepted the outcome. When the news reached the Crusader camp, the reaction was as mixed as Richard had anticipated. Some breathed a sigh of relief. The long ordeal was finally over, and they could go home. Others were furious. Was this all they had to show for 3 years of fighting? But most were simply too exhausted to muster any strong emotion. They were too weary to feel anger or celebrate. All they wanted was to leave this place that had devoured their youth, their health, and their comrades. The days leading up to departure were filled with a surreal atmosphere. Soldiers packed their equipment, dismantled tents, and cleared the camp. Traces of 3 years of life in the Holy Land were being systematically erased. Richard watched it all with a strange feeling. Had it really happened? Had these 3 years truly existed? Or was it just a long, exhausting dream? Soon, there would be no evidence left that they had ever been here, as if the Crusaders had never come. A few soldiers chose to remain in the Holy Land, perhaps a few hundred. Mainly those who had found new lives here, men who had married local women, opened shops, or converted to some syncretic faith. Richard blessed them. But in his heart, he knew their fate. Most would die within a few years, or eventually return to Europe. The Holy Land never truly welcomed the Crusaders to settle permanently. This land had its own rules, and outsiders found it difficult to truly integrate. Richard's final task was to inspect the defenses of Acre. The city was now the last major stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land. He meticulously examined the walls, the harbor, and the garrison's deployment. He left a multi-page set of instructions for the garrison commander: how to withstand a siege, how to manage supplies, and how to maintain relations with the local inhabitants. He did everything in his power to ensure the city's survival after his departure. But Richard knew in his heart that this was far from enough. Acre needed continuous support: money, soldiers, supplies, political backing. All of this had to come from Europe. Yet, after the failure of the Third Crusade, who would still invest in the Holy Land? Would the Pope call for another crusade? Would the kings of Europe respond once more? Richard deeply doubted it. The golden age of the Crusades might have come to an end. The future belonged to other forms of conflict and cooperation. On his last night before departure, Richard wrote several letters. One to his mother, telling her he was finally coming home. Another to the ministers of England, warning them to strengthen their surveillance of John. He also drafted a personal letter to Saladin, expressing his respect as an adversary, acknowledging that in another world they might have been friends. But in this one, they were destined to be enemies. He wished Saladin a just reign, even though they worshipped different gods. But Richard ultimately did not seal the letter to Saladin. He hesitated for a long time before finally throwing it into the fire. Some words are better left unspoken. Some emotions better kept private. He watched the parchment curl, blacken, and turn to ash in the flames. Just like his 3 years in the Holy Land, it would all become ash and fading memories. History would remember the battles, but not these private moments and complex emotions. At dawn on the 9th of October, 1192, Richard stood for the last time on the hill overlooking Jerusalem. This time, there was no army, no advisors. Only himself. The city shimmered faintly through the morning mist, its golden dome catching the first rays of sunlight. He stood there for a long while, trying to etch the image into his memory. Perhaps one day he would return. Perhaps the next crusade would succeed. But he knew it likely would not be him. His time in the Holy Land had come to an end. Richard recalled the man he had been 3 years ago when he first arrived here. 32 years old, brimming with confidence and certainty, convinced that God was on his side, destined to be the hero who would liberate Jerusalem. That Richard had died somewhere in the Holy Land, killed by illness, disappointment, and harsh reality. The man standing here now was different, older, wearier, wiser, but also more broken. The Holy Land changed everyone who came, and Richard was no exception. Richard turned and walked away, this time without looking back. He rode back to the camp and gave the final orders to depart. The ships were waiting in the port of Jaffa. He would leave by sea, just as he had arrived, but the journey home would be entirely different. He could not go through France, for Philip's army was waiting for him. He would have to risk the longer, more dangerous northern route. But that was a problem for the future. For now, he only wanted to leave this land that had taken 3 years of his life without giving him the answers he sought. On the afternoon of the 9th of October, Richard's ship departed from the port of Jaffa. He stood on the deck, watching the coastline of the Holy Land gradually disappear over the horizon. 3 years, 3 years of fighting disease, victories, defeats, hope, and despair. The cost of those 3 years manifested in different ways. His broken health, the kingdom's depleted wealth, the lives of thousands of soldiers. What had it all been for? A few cities, a fragile truce, an unfinished mission. By any measure, this was not the victory he had promised when he set out. But there were other gains. though Richard might never have admitted them. He learned about limitations, that even the Lionheart could not do everything, could not defy the realities of geography, logistics, and human nature. He learned the cruelty of choice, that every goal has its cost, sometimes too high to bear. He learned humility, that military genius cannot solve political problems, and personal courage cannot compensate for systemic flaws. These lessons felt like failures at the time, but they were seeds of wisdom. Unfortunately, Richard did not have the time to let them take root and grow. Below deck, the soldiers talk of home. They speak of England's green fields, France's fine wines, and the warm embrace of family. But no one speaks of Jerusalem anymore. That dream is dead, crushed beneath the weight of reality. The stories they will bring home are not epic tales of glorious conquest, but simple narratives of survival. How they endured in the Holy Land, how they persevered through sickness, how they maintained some dignity in defeat. These stories will not be recorded by chroniclers, but they are no less true. The ship sailed northward, toward an unknown yet inevitable fate. Richard did not know what awaited him ahead: imprisonment in an Austrian dungeon, the heavy burden of ransom upon the people of England, endless war with Philip, and ultimately, that absurd death at Chellius. If he could have seen the future, would he have made different choices? Perhaps not. For even after all that had happened in the Holy Land, even after all the lessons learned, Richard remained Richard, a warrior, unable to cease fighting, even when the battle held no meaning, even when victory was unattainable. This was his gift, his curse, and his destiny. The ship sailed on, carrying a shattered dream, a weary army, and a disillusioned yet unconquered king. The chapter of the Holy Land had closed, but Richard's story was far from over. Ahead lay more battles, more victories, more defeats, and finally, the arrow that would change everything. But those were matters for the future. For now, in October 1192, on the Mediterranean Sea, Richard was simply a tired man, sailing the long journey home, bearing an unspeakable loss and an unacknowledged relief. The dream of the Holy Land was over, but life went on with all its cruelty, complexity, and unpredictability. In October 1192, Richard set out to return to England. However, he could not take the most direct route through France. Philip had already declared open hostility, and crossing France would be like walking into a trap. Richard chose a longer but seemingly safer route across the Adriatic Sea, through Austria, and then north to Germany. This decision would change everything. In December, Richard's ship encountered a storm in the Adriatic Sea and was forced to land near Venice. He attempted to disguise himself as an ordinary traveler to cross Austria. However, it was difficult for Europe's most renowned warrior to conceal his identity. To make matters worse, he had offended Duke Leopold of Austria in the Holy Land. At Acre, Richard had thrown Leopold's banner into the mud. On the 21st of December, Richard was captured near Vienna. Leopold as soldiers recognized him. Even though he was dressed as a servant, when the news reached Leopold, the Duke was overjoyed. He had captured the King of England. This was not only revenge, but also a tremendous opportunity for wealth. The ransom would be astronomical. But Leopold dared not keep this wealth for himself. He handed Richard over to his liege, Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry also harbored hatred for Richard, as Richard had supported Henry's enemies in the Holy Land. Now, the most powerful king of England had become the emperor's prisoner. When news of Richard's imprisonment reached England, the kingdom fell into panic. There was no king, no clear authority, only a group of ministers trying to maintain order. To make matters worse, Richard's brother, John, saw an opportunity. He began plotting to seize the throne, even forming an alliance with King Philip of France. Eleanor, Richard's mother, once again demonstrated her strength, This 70-year-old woman took control of the situation. She steadied the loyal nobles, curbed John's ambitions, and simultaneously began raising funds for the ransom. However, the ransom amount was staggering. 150,000 marks, equivalent to 3 years of England's total tax revenue. Eleanor launched one of the largest fundraising campaigns in history. Churches surrendered their silver to be melted down into coins. Nobles were compelled to contribute a quarter of their income. Peasants handed over their savings. The entire kingdom was drained. People complained, but they paid. For without Richard, the kingdom would have descended into civil war. Richard was not entirely helpless in captivity. Emperor Henry VIII recognized that Richard was more valuable as a hostage than as a prisoner. He allowed Richard to maintain a certain degree of dignity, even permitting him to attend imperial councils. Richard seized this opportunity to demonstrate his political skills, though they were far less impressive than his military prowess. At a famous parliament, Richard defended himself against accusations of misconduct in the Holy Land. His speech was so powerful and so passionate that it is said to have moved everyone present. Even his enemies had to admit, here was a king, even in captivity. But dignity cannot replace freedom. Richard spent 1 year and 6 weeks in captivity. During this time, he wrote poetry. He reflected, he plotted revenge. He wrote to his mother, urging her to expedite the fundraising. He wrote to John, warning him not to act rashly. He waited, though waiting tormented him more than battle. In February 1194, the ransom was finally raised. A portion of the 150,000 marks, approximately 100,000, was transported to Germany, with the remainder held as security. The money filled dozens of wagons and required an armed escort for its journey. This marked the largest transfer of wealth in England's history. For the common Englishman, it was a disaster. Farmers lost a year's income. Merchants went bankrupt. Churches were impoverished. They gave everything for a king, who never lived among them, for his adventures in distant lands. This was the cost of Richard's absentee rule, paid by those who least deserved to bear it. On the 4th of March, 1194, Richard was released. He immediately set out for England. This time, he truly returned. Albeit only briefly, he landed at Sandwich, welcomed by cheering crowds. Yet, how much of the cheering was genuine joy, and how much was feigned enthusiasm? The people were glad their king had returned, but they also remembered the price that had been paid for it. Richard stayed in England for 2 months. He was recrowned to reaffirm his authority, punished some of John's supporters, and rewarded the loyal ones. Then, in May 1194, he departed once more. This time, he went to France to deal with Philip. England it was left behind again, managed by ministers. Richard's final stay in England revealed a brutal truth. For him, England was not a home, but a resource. Its value lay in how much money, how many soldiers, and how many supplies it could provide. The well-being of the kingdom, the happiness of the people, these were never priorities. This is a dilemma each of us faces who bears the cost of pursuing dreams. Richard sought glory, the ideals of the Crusades and military victories. Yet it was the English peasants who paid the bill. This is not a uniquely medieval problem. Today, as we pursue our personal goals, who is paying the price? There is another lesson. Did imprisonment change Richard? Over a year of confinement, loss of freedom, dependence on the mercy of others. Did these make him a better ruler? The answer from history is no. Upon his release, he immediately repeated the same pattern: war, absence, neglect of the kingdom. Some learn from suffering, others simply continue. If even the loss of freedom cannot change a person, what can? Perhaps the most profound lesson is this: ransom is not merely about money. It is a ransom of trust, of patience, of goodwill. The English paid money to redeem their king. but they also exhausted their trust in the monarchy. That trust, once lost, cannot be bought back with any amount of gold. In May 1194, Richard crossed the English Channel to Normandy, where he would spend the last 5 years of his life in endless warfare with Philip. He would never return to England again, the kingdom for which he had fought to inherit. The kingdom that had paid an exorbitant ransom to rescue him would never see their king again. In 1194, Richard returned to France, entering the final phase of his life. Over the next 5 years, he dedicated himself to one thing: fighting against King Philip of France. This was not for conquest or expansion, but to hold on to the territories he already possessed. His empire was on the defensive, and defense required ceaseless warfare. Philip was a clever adversary. He knew he could not defeat Richard on the battlefield, so he adopted a different strategy, bribing Richard's vassals, besieging minor castles, draining England's resources, and waiting for Richard to make a mistake. It was a war of attrition, and Philip had the patience for it. Richard's response was to build. He constructed the Setio Gaillard on the banks of the Seine, an engineering marvel. It took 2 years and cost a fortune, but it was a masterpiece of military architecture. Richard called it, "My beautiful one, year-old daughter." He poured all his military knowledge into it. Defensive techniques learned from the Holy Land, weaknesses learned from sieges. But while the castle was magnificent, it exposed Richard's core problem. He used architecture to solve political issues and military force to address diplomatic ones. Gale protected the Seine Valley, but it did not resolve the fundamental conflict. Both Richard and Philip wanted the same territory, and only war or compromise could settle it. Richard never compromised. From 1194 to 1199, the war between Richard and Philip was a series of countless minor conflicts. There were no large-scale battles, only sieges, raids, and ambushes. One castle was captured, another was retaken. One lord betrayed his side, another was bought back. This was the reality of medieval warfare, slow, costly, and seemingly endless. For the common soldier, this was hell. They fought through scorching summers and freezing winters. They besieged castles for months, surviving on rotten food. Their wounds festered without proper medical care. Many died from disease rather than battle. Yet Richard drove them onward, for to stop meant defeat. Richard himself paid a price. He was in his 40s, no longer a young warrior. Years of battle had left their scars. Malaria from the Holy Land recurred repeatedly, but he never stopped. He seemed unable to stop. Fighting had become his instinct, his identity, the only way of life he knew. War is expensive. Richard needed a constant flow of money to pay soldiers, buy supplies, build castles, and bribe allies. Where did the money come from? England. Taxes were raised again and again. Every time Richard needed money, messengers rode to London. The king required more funds. The English complain, but they pay. What else can they do? Refusing the king would be seen as treason. Yet each new tax erodes loyalty. People begin to question, why should we pay for wars in Normandy? What do those castles have to do with us? Does our king even care about us? Richard never asked these questions to him. The answer was obvious. These territories had belonged to his family for generations. Defending them was his duty. As for whether the English understood or agreed, that didn't matter. The king commanded and the subjects obeyed. This way of thinking might have worked in 1194, but it was sowing the seeds of resentment that would come back to haunt the future. In March 1199, Richard, at the age of 41, was still fighting. This time it was in Limousin, in the southern part of his domain. A minor lord had rebelled, and Richard went to suppress it. It should have been a straightforward operation: surround a few castles, accept surrender, and return home. But fate had other plans. One of the castles was called Chalus. It was insignificant, a small fortification, a handful of defenders, no strategic value. It was said that Roman treasure had been found there. Peasants digging up golden statues. Richard wanted it, not for strategy, but for greed, or simply because he could. The siege began. However, it was not a serious military operation. The defenders numbered only a few dozen, and the castle would surrender quickly. Richard had not even brought enough soldiers. He merely wanted to finish quickly and return to more important wars. On the evening of the 26th of March, while inspecting the walls, Richard was shot at by a crossbowman. The arrow struck Richard in the left shoulder. It wasn't a fatal wound. At least, not initially. Richard returned to camp, where the army doctors attempted to extract the arrowhead. But their clumsy efforts tore the wound wider. Infection set in an era without antibiotics. Infection was a death sentence. Challis quickly surrendered. Richard ordered the capture of all the defenders to be hanged, except for the crossbowman who had shot him. That man was brought before Richard. Richard asked him, "Why did you shoot me?" The crossbowman replied, "Because you killed my father and brother." This was the bill for Richard's years of war, now coming due. Richard did something unexpected. He forgave the crossbowman, even giving him 100 shillings to leave. Perhaps the pain made him generous, or perhaps he knew he was dying and sought redemption. Or maybe he recognized the justice in the crossbowman's words. We will never know. But this gesture changed nothing. The infection had already spread. Richard lay in a humble tent, dead from an insignificant siege, for a treasure that might not exist at a small castle no one cared about. This was not the end a warrior deserved, not in a great battle, not in Jerusalem, not in defending England, but in Ch Phalus, because of greed or pride or simply habit. Each of us also faces this question: where will we die? Not in the literal sense of location, but in which part of life, on the path of chasing dreams, while caring for family, in building something lasting, or in pursuing meaningless goals, simply because we cannot stop. Richard died in a place he shouldn't have been, doing something he shouldn't have been doing. There is also a cruel irony. The crossbowman, whom Richard had pardoned, was captured and flayed to death by Richard's generals immediately after his death. Even in death, Richard's generosity was overturned by the culture of violence he had created. This is the essence of legacy, not what we say, but what systems we build and what culture we foster. On the 26th of March, 1199, the moment the arrow struck Richard, his fate was sealed. In the 12th century, there were no antibiotics, no sterile surgeries. Wound infections were almost always fatal, but Richard was no ordinary man. He refused to yield immediately. He still had 11 days to live. In the first few days, Richard tried to continue working. He received his generals, issued orders, and handled affairs from his bed. But the pain grew increasingly intense. The skin around the wound turned black and emitted a foul odor. Gangrene was spreading, consuming his body like a slow poison. The doctors were at a loss. They tried every treatment available at the time: herbal poultices, bloodletting, prayers. Nothing worked. The infection had entered his bloodstream, and the fever set in. Richard's body, that strong frame which had conquered countless battlefields, was breaking down from within. In early April, Richard knew he was dying. He began to make preparations. First, he summoned his mother, Eleanor. She came from afar, this 77-year-old woman, to witness the death of her most beloved son with her own eyes. When she arrived, she saw a man who no longer resembled himself, emaciated, feverish, and weak. Richard faced the issue he had avoided all his life: succession. He had no legitimate heir. To whom should his kingdom pass? There were two choices: his brother John or Arthur, the 12th. year-old son of his deceased brother Geoffrey. The rational choice was Arthur, young but of closer bloodline. But Richard chose John, perhaps because John was an adult and could rule immediately, perhaps because of blood ties. John was his brother, or perhaps simply because Richard was too pained to think deeply. Whatever the reason, this decision would have catastrophic consequences. John would become one of England's worst kings. Richard still needed to deal with his property. He left his most precious items, his crown and scepter, to his nephew Otto, a contender for the Holy Roman Empire. His wealth was distributed to monasteries and the poor. His heart was to be buried in Rouen, his entrails in Chalice, and his body beside his father. Even in death, he would be divided. Richard was devout, or at least he tried to appear devout at the end of his life. He summoned a priest and made his confession. What did he confess? We do not fully know. Atrocities in war, neglect of the kingdom, pride and greed. Confessions in the Middle Ages were private, but we can guess that his list of sins was long. He specifically requested forgiveness for the crossbowman who shot him. However, as mentioned earlier, this generous gesture was overruled by his subordinates. After Richard's death, the man was brutally executed. This reveals a profound truth: personal goodwill cannot compensate for systemic violence. Richard had established a regime based on force, and that system would operate according to its own logic. In his final days, Richard might have been reflecting on his life, 41 years, at least 25 of which were spent in battle. What had he won? A legendary reputation. Yes. Countless victories. Yes. But what had he built? What had he protected? What had he left behind? The answer was disheartening. Almost nothing. The 6th of April, 1199, evening in a simple tent, candlelight flickered as the air mingled with the scent of blood, medicinal herbs, and the impending presence of death. Richard I, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, the Lionheart, lay on his bed, his life slowly ebbing away. Eleanor, his mother, held his hand. This woman had witnessed too much death: her first husband, Louis, her second husband, Henry, and her two sons, Henry and Geoffrey. Now it was Richard, her most beloved son. There were no tears on her face. She had already cried them all. Only sorrow and acceptance remained. Richard's final words were not accurately recorded. Different chroniclers offer varying versions. Perhaps he spoke a warning about John. Perhaps he uttered a prayer to God. Or perhaps he simply groaned in pain. We do not know. We only know that as evening fell, he ceased to breathe. The news of Richard's death spread through Europe like a shockwave. In England, the reaction was complex: grief, relief, anxiety. The king was dead, and the new king was John, whom no one trusted. In France, upon hearing the news, Philip was said to have remarked, "Now I can breathe freely." His most dangerous enemy was gone. In the Holy Land, Saladin's successors expressed respect upon hearing the news. Richard was an enemy, but he was a worthy adversary. A Muslim chronicler wrote, "May Allah have mercy on him. Though he was our enemy, he was a noble warrior." This respect, coming from former opponents, may be the truest epitaph for Richard. Richard's death in Chaluz was no accident, but the logical outcome of the choices he made throughout his life. He chose to fight forever, so he died on the battlefield. He chose to pursue every goal, no matter how small, so he died while chasing a trivial treasure. He chose never to rest, so he died in action, not in peace. For each of us, there is a profound lesson. The way we die often reflects the way we live. If we spend our lives chasing vanity, we will die chasing vanity. If we neglect what truly matters throughout our lives, we will die with regret. If we build meaningful relationships and achievements, we will depart in peace. Richard also taught us the harsh truth about legacy. It is not what you intend to leave behind, but what you actually leave. Richard intended to leave a reclaimed Jerusalem. He left a failed crusade. He intended to leave a powerful empire. He left a kingdom on the brink of collapse. He intended to leave an heir. He left John. But there are other legacies. Richard left behind stories, tales of courage, tales of perseverance, tales of human ambition and human limitations. These stories have spread for 800 years and still teach us today. Perhaps this is his true legacy, not the kingdom he built, but the legend he became. The question is, was it worth it? After Richard's death, John became king. However, he faced a kingdom that had been drained. The treasury was empty. The people were weary of war, and the nobles were disloyal. To make matters worse, John lacked Richard's military prowess and personal charisma. He possessed all of Richard's flaws, but none of his virtues. King Philip of France immediately launched an attack. He supported Richard's nephew Arthur, claiming that Arthur was the legitimate heir. The nobles of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine faced a choice to support John or Arthur. Many chose the latter. The loyalty that Richard had maintained through strength crumbled in John's hands. In 1202, Arthur was captured by John, then he vanished. Historians believe John either killed him with his own hands or ordered his murder. Whatever the truth, the murder of a 16-year-old boy enraged Europe. Nobles defected from John in large numbers. Philip had the perfect excuse to invade. In 1204, just 5 years after Richard's death, Normandy fell. Philip captured Rouen and took Gaillard, Richard's beautiful daughter. The supposedly impregnable castle, John fled back to England without even putting up a decent defense. The Plantagenet Empire, as territories in France, a legacy built over a century and a half, collapsed. Why did the empire collapse so quickly? One reason is that Richard never established strong institutions. His empire relied on his personal abilities, his military skills, his reputation, his presence. Without Richard, there was no system to sustain it. This is the fatal flaw of charismatic leadership. In contrast, Philip established a bureaucratic system. He had professional administrators managing finance, justice, and taxation. His kingdom did not rely on his personal presence. Even when Philip was absent, the system continued to function. This is why France grew increasingly powerful over the following centuries, while England's French territories disappeared. The lesson this comparison offers for our modern lives is that whether in work, family, or any organization, relying entirely on one person is fragile. True strength lies not in individual heroism, but in building systems, processes, and cultures that can operate independently. Richard never understood this. The loss of French territories was a disaster for John, but a turning point for England. Suddenly, the English kings could no longer treat the kingdom as a mere purse. They had to truly govern it, for it was all they had left. This forced focus would ultimately lead England to develop a unique political system. John attempted to reconquer Normandy, which required more money. However, this time the English nobles rebelled. In 1215, they forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited the power of the monarchy. This was a lesson learned from the tyranny of Richard and John. The king could not do as he pleased. There had to be legal constraints. Many clauses of the Magna Carta directly addressed the abuses of power by Richard and John. Taxes could not be levied arbitrarily. Imprisonment could not be imposed at will. Fair trials were required. These principles, 800 years later, remain the foundation of democratic societies. Ironically, Richard's failures indirectly gave rise to these advancements. Richard's failure to secure his succession taught us a costly lesson. He had 10 years to prepare an heir. He could have adopted his nephew Arthur and trained him as his successor. He could have fathered children. He had a wife, though he neglected her. He could have established a regency council to ensure a smooth transition. He did none of these things. Why? Perhaps he thought he would live forever, not die at 41. Perhaps he was too busy fighting to consider it. Perhaps he simply procrastinated, because planning for succession meant confronting his own mortality. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. John's reign, the collapse of the empire, decades of chaos. In our own lives, we also procrastinate on important but not urgent matters. Writing a will, training a replacement, documenting crucial knowledge, mending broken relationships. We always think, there is still time. Richard thought so too, until he ran out of time. Don't wait until you're lying in Charis's tent to start thinking about your legacy. By 1214, the Angevin Empire had lost nearly all of its territories in France, what Henry II had spent his life building, and Richard had struggled to defend vanished under John's rule. All that remained was England itself, along with some control over Ireland and Wales. A great European empire had been reduced to an island nation. Historians debate, was it inevitable? Some say yes, the Angevin Empire was too vast and fragmented, destined to collapse regardless of who ruled. Others argue no, suggesting that if Richard had established better institutions, or if John had been more capable, the empire might have endured. The truth, likely, lies somewhere in between. The challenges were immense, but leadership failures made them insurmountable. But there is a deeper question here. Should the empire have survived? This empire, pieced together across half of Europe through conquest, marriage, and inheritance, was not desired by many of its subjects. Perhaps its collapse was not a tragedy, but a natural process. Imposed unity ultimately disintegrates, returning to natural boundaries. In 1216, John died in war like his brother, though less heroically. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, succeeded him. The Plantagenet dynasty continued, but it was forever changed. The once great continental empire had become the Kingdom of England. This was not the legacy Richard had desired. Standing on the ruins of an empire, what have we learned? First, anything built on individual capability rather than systems is fragile. Second, neglecting succession planning leads to disaster. Third, sometimes loss forces necessary change. England lost its continental territories, but ultimately developed stronger institutions. Finally, this reminds us of the nature of empires. They rise, they shine, and then they collapse. Richard's empire, the Roman Empire, all empires. Nothing is eternal. What truly endures is not territory or power, but ideas, institutions, stories. Richard's empire is gone, but his story remains. Perhaps that is what ultimately matters. After Richard's death, strange things happened. His legend began to grow faster than it had while he was alive. Bards composed songs praising his courage. Chroniclers embellished his achievements. In folk tales, he became the perfect knight, brave, noble, and devout. The failures of reality were forgotten, leaving only glory behind. Why? Because people need heroes. The Crusades failed. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and the immense cost seemed meaningless. But if Richard was a hero, if he almost succeeded, if it was just bad luck, then the sacrifices had meaning. Legends fill the void left by reality. Soon, Richard appeared in the tales of Robin Hood, the good but absent king, fighting in the Holy Land, while the wicked John seized power. This version conveniently overlooks that Richard himself was an absent ruler, whose absence created the vacuum John exploited. But legends care little for such details. By the late Middle Ages, Richard had become the epitome of chivalry. nobles emulated him. Artists painted him, and writers wrote about him. The title, Lionheart, attained a mythical status. He became synonymous with courage. Yet, the greater the legend grew, the more the real Richard was buried. Richard's legend demonstrates the astonishing power of reputation. In his own time, his reputation helped him win battles. Enemies feared him even before the fight began. After his death, his reputation shaped historical memory. The real Richard, a flawed and failing man, was replaced by the legendary Richard. This power is a double-edged sword. Reputation can inspire people, create a legacy, and influence future generations. But it can also distort the truth, conceal mistakes, and prevent us from learning from our failures. If we only remember Richard's courage and forget his failures, what lessons do we learn? We will repeat his mistakes. In our own lives, we too face this temptation to pursue what appears good rather than what is truly good. To showcase a perfect life on social media instead of a real one, to chase titles and awards rather than genuine achievements, to build a personal brand instead of creating real value. Richard walked this path. It gave him 8 centuries of fame. But at what cost? What does the legend conceal? First, the massacre at Acre. 2,700 unarmed prisoners were executed. This was Richard's darkest deed, yet medieval tales either ignore it or justify it. They were infidels, the legend says, as if that were reason enough. Secondly, there was his neglect of England. Richard spent only 6 months in the kingdom. Yet he drained its wealth. The English paid a heavy price for the wars of a king who barely knew them. Yet in legend, Richard was England's glory, not its burden. Third is his strategic failure. He approached Jerusalem 3 times but never attacked. He built the fortress of Chateau-Gaillard, yet it fell quickly after his death. His war with Philip resolved nothing. Yet legend remembers only his victories. Arsuf Jaffa, overlooking that in the end, he achieved none of his major objectives. Interestingly, each era reshapes Richard according to its own needs. Victorian England saw an empire builder. The 19th century Romantics saw the ideal of chivalry. Historians of the 20th century began to question, perhaps he was not a hero, but a warmonger and a poor ruler. The 21st century brings new questions. Richard's sexual orientation has become a subject of academic debate. His crusades are seen as early examples of cultural conflict. His absentee rule is compared to the issues faced by modern corporate CEOs. Each generation finds in Richard a mirror reflecting its own concerns. What does this tell us? History is not fixed. It is a dialogue, with each generation conversing with the past, asking its own questions and seeking its own answers. Richard is not someone who can be correctly understood. He is a complex individual, and different people will see different truths. All of these truths hold a certain validity. What kind of legacy did Richard want? We cannot be certain, but we can guess. He wanted to be remembered as a great warrior, a successful crusader, a noble king. He got the first 800 years later. People still call him Lionheart. But the other 2, history has rendered a more complex verdict. This raises a question that everyone faces. What kind of reputation should we pursue? Is it important to be remembered? If so, why is being remembered more important? Is it because of what we have truly accomplished, or because we have successfully marketed ourselves? Richard was very successful in the latter aspect, but a failure in the former. Perhaps a better question is not, how will I be remembered? But what impact do I want to leave behind? Richard's legacy was largely negative. A hollowed-out kingdom, a collapsed empire, thousands of innocent lives lost. He's remembered, yes, but was it worth it? If given the choice, would you prefer immense fame with a negative impact or modest recognition with a positive one? Ultimately, Richard's story teaches us the limitations of reputation. Reputation can endure for centuries, but it cannot change what you actually did. Legends may glorify you, but they cannot erase your victims. Fame can make you immortal, yet it cannot allow you to alter your choices after death. In our brief lives, each of us makes choices, substance over appearance, impact over image. Building over performing, Richard chose the latter. He gained a legend, but lost the chance to do what truly matters. To be a good ruler, to establish lasting institutions, and to create peace and prosperity for his people. So when you think about your legacy, don't just ask, how will I be remembered? Ask, what real change do I want to create? Ask, whose lives are better because of me? Ask, what have I built that will last beyond me? These questions are harder to answer than those about reputation, but they are more important, because in the end, it is not the legend that defines us, but our actions. The first lesson Richard taught us was the simplest and most profound. Presence is irreplaceable. He tried to rule the kingdom from the battlefield and manage the empire from afar. He failed. No amount of letters, messengers, or commands could ever substitute for true presence. This is not just a problem for kings. Consider the parent who always says, "Once I finish this project," only to miss their child's growing up. Think of the spouse constantly away on business trips, returning home to find the relationship has grown distant. Reflect on the person who brings work home, physically present but mentally absent. We all risk becoming the absent king in our own lives. Presence is not merely physical existence. It is attention, engagement, and genuine participation. You can sit next to family while staring at your phone. That is not presence. You can attend a meeting while your mind wanders elsewhere. That is not presence. Richard's lesson: if something matters to you, give it your true presence, not just your shadow. Richard's ambition propelled him to greatness, yet it also destroyed him. This is the balance each of us faces. Ambition is necessary, driving us to grow, pursue goals, and overcome obstacles. But unchecked ambition can devour everything: relationships, health, morality, and ultimately, ourselves. The question is not, do I have ambition? But rather, what does my ambition serve? Richard's ambition served his own glory at the cost of the kingdom's well-being. What about your ambition? Does it serve only yourself, or does it also benefit others? Does it drive you toward meaningful goals, or does it merely keep you running faster on a treadmill, going nowhere? Healthy ambition has its limits. It knows when to say, enough. It understands that success is not worth sacrificing family, health, or integrity. Richard never set these boundaries. He always wanted more battles, more victories, more glory. Until an arrow stopped him. Don't wait for the arrow to fly before setting your boundaries. Richard is a genius in military affairs, but a disaster in all other aspects. This imbalance is quite common today. Some excel at work, but are incompetent in family relationships. Others are adept at making money, yet clueless about finding meaning. Some master professional skills, but lack basic interpersonal abilities. The issue is not having a specialty, but having only a specialty. If Richard had also developed skills in governance, diplomacy, and succession planning beyond his military expertise, his legacy would have been entirely different. For us, if you excel at only one thing, what happens when that one thing is not enough? When the market changes? When life stages shift? The solution is not to abandon specialization, but to consciously develop multiple areas of competence. Excel at work while learning how to be a good parent, partner, and friend. Dive deep professionally while maintaining a breadth of interests. Build T-shaped skills. Depth plus breadth. This gives you choices, adaptability, and a full life. Richard never honestly calculated the full cost of his choices. The Crusades, they seemed glorious. But who paid the price? The English peasants, the war with Philip. Defending his territories was necessary, but the cost was a drained kingdom, a suffering people, and ultimately, a collapsed empire. We often make the same mistake, focusing only on the gains, not the costs. Every major decision comes with a price, and often that price is borne by those who do not make the decision. Working overtime for a promotion, the cost might be missing time with family. Moving to a new city to pursue a dream. The cost could be leaving behind a support network, starting a business. The cost may be stability and sleep. These are not necessarily wrong choices, but we must be honest about the costs. More importantly, ask who is paying the price. If it is only yourself, that is your choice. But if your choices make others pay, family, team, community, then it requires dialogue and consent, not a unilateral decision. Richard never asked the English if they were willing to pay for his wars. Don't be that kind of decision maker in your own life. Richard's most fatal failure was never preparing for his absence, whether temporary or permanent. He cultivated no successor, established no system that could operate independently, and left no record of his knowledge. This is not a problem unique to kings. Are you the only person in the team who knows how a certain system works? What would happen if you were gone tomorrow? Does your family know where the important documents are? Have you documented those processes that are only in your head? This isn't pessimism. It is responsibility. Richard thought he was indispensable, and his absence ended up causing a disaster. The deeper meaning of preparing for absence, cultivating others. Richard can nurture his nephew Arthur as a successor, providing him with experience and guidance. You can mentor team members, share skills, create documentation, and establish processes. This doesn't make you replaceable. Instead, it demonstrates true leadership. Your value lies not in monopolizing knowledge, but in empowering others. Richard leaped into the water at Jaffa to lead 80 knights against thousands of enemies. That was courage. He inspected the walls at Chalus without proper protection. That was recklessness. What is the difference? Courage is taking calculated risks for important goals. Recklessness is taking unnecessary risks for trivial objectives. In daily life, we also face such choices, taking risks for important opportunities, changing jobs, starting new relationships, learning new skills. That is courage, taking risks to prove something or out of boredom. Dangerous driving, financial speculation, unnecessary confrontations. That is recklessness. Ask yourself, is this risk worth it? Is the goal important? Have I considered the consequences? Richard's story is not meant for us to emulate him, but to avoid his mistakes. We do not need to conquer kingdoms, but we must conquer our own tendencies. Constant absence, unchecked ambition, excessive specialization, ignoring costs, lack of preparation, and confusing courage with recklessness. These are universal human challenges. Every day we make small choices that accumulate into significant consequences. Are we present today or distracted? Do we pursue ambition or balance? Do we develop new skills or stay in our comfort zone? Do we consider the costs or only see the benefits? Do we prepare for the future or assume there will always be time? Do we do brave things or reckless things? Richard failed in these choices. We can do better. Not because we are better than him, but because we have his story as a warning. Richard's ambition propelled him to victory at Arsuf, and also drove him to his death at Chalus. The same force, different outcomes. Ambition helped him seize his first castle at 15, and led him to risk everything for a non-existent treasure at 41. It was both engine and poison. The pure willpower Eleanor had seen in Richard's childhood never faded, nor was it ever tamed. It carried him across Europe, to the Holy Land, and through countless battlefields. In the end, it brought him to Chelphalis. Ambition does not automatically shut off after success. It continues to burn until it consumes everything. The 2,700 prisoners at Acre were executed on Richard's orders. Saladin was furious when he heard the news, but his own armies had also slaughtered captives. What would Philip have done if he had been there? John, any medieval commander, brutality was the norm in the warfare of that era, and all participants were stained with blood. But Richard had a choice. He could have waited longer for the ransom, left a garrison to guard the prisoners, or sought other solutions. He chose the quickest and most brutal way because he was impatient. This choice was not an inevitability of the times, but a personal decision. Historical context explains, but does not excuse. The Plantagenet Empire spanned half of Europe from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Without telegraphs or railways, only messengers on horseback took weeks to deliver messages. How could one person rule such a vast territory? Even Richard, even if he truly tried, might not have been able to. But Richard never truly attempted. He did not establish an administrative system, did not cultivate local officials, and did not create a financial system. He relied on personal presence and the deterrence of force. When he was absent, the system failed. Philip built a bureaucracy, so France remained strong for centuries. Richard built a legend, so his empire collapsed within 5 years. The question is not whether the empire could be sustained, but whether Richard attempted to make it sustainable. He chose the battlefield over the archives, conquest over governance. Perhaps the empire was destined to collapse, but Richard hastened the process. In January 1192, Richard stood on a hill overlooking Jerusalem. The golden dome of the Holy City shimmered in the sunlight. His crusaders cheered, believing they were finally about to launch an attack. But Richard turned and walked away. It was the second time he had done so, and there would be a third a few months later. His reasoning was sound. The city was too difficult to defend. The supply lines were too long, and Saladin would lay siege to it. But the soldiers did not understand logic. They understood symbols. They had traveled thousands of kilometers from Europe, fought for years, and now the holy city was within reach. Yet the king's disappointment turned into resentment, and resentment turned into doubt. What if Richard attacked and briefly occupied Jerusalem? Even if he lost it a few months later, at least the symbolic mission of the crusade would have been accomplished. The soldiers could say, "We liberated the holy city." Even if only temporarily, pragmatism says this is the better choice. Idealism says an incomplete victory is no victory at all. Who is right? History does not answer. 50 years after Richard's death, chroniclers began to embellish his story. A century later, he appeared in knightly legends. 200 years later, he became the ideal king in the tales of Robin Hood. Each generation reshaped him, discarding inconvenient facts and adding desired virtues. Victorian Britain needed imperial heroes, so Richard became an empire builder. 20th century historians questioned imperialism, so Richard became a warmonger. The 21st century cares about gender and sexuality, so Richard's private life has become the focus of debate. History is like a mirror. Each generation sees its own concerns. Does this mean there is no real Richard? The real Richard died in 1199. We only have the traces he left behind: chronicles, letters, buildings, consequences. Each generation reconstructs him from these traces, a process influenced by contemporary concerns. This is not a flaw. It is the essence of history. Richard was already a legend in his lifetime. Bards sang of his exploits, sometimes beginning their compositions even as the battles were still raging. This real-time myth, making trapped Richard. He had to constantly prove that the legend was true. Every battle had to be won, every challenge accepted, every danger faced. Charles is the ultimate manifestation of this trap. A 41-year-old man, weary and ill, who should have stayed in the rear to command, instead went to the front lines to inspect the walls. Why? Because the Lionheart would have done so. Because legends need to be maintained. Because reputation is the master, not the servant. An arrow ended this cycle. These dilemmas have no answers. Only trade-offs. Ambition drives you forward, but may consume you. Judging history requires context, but also principles. Systems matter, but so do individual choices. Idealism has its place, but so does pragmatism. Reputation is a tool, but can become a trap. Richard made choices in all these matters. We may agree or disagree, but we cannot escape the questions his story raises. These questions follow us, echoing in our own decisions, not on the scale of kingdoms, but on the scale of our own lives. Richard's value lies not in providing answers, but in offering a mirror, a complex, contradictory, and human mirror. This mirror becomes useful when you face your own choices. It doesn't tell you what to do, but reminds you that every choice has consequences, carries a cost, and becomes part of the story you leave behind. The 6th of April, 1199 evening. Chalus, the candlelight flickered in the tent as Richard took his last breath. Eleanor sat beside him. At 77, she had already bid farewell to two husbands and 3 sons. There were no tears on her face, only a profound weariness outside. The camp fell into silence. No one knew what would happen next. It took several days for the news to spread. Messengers rode across France and crossed the English Channel. On the 11th of April, London heard, church bells rang, and people gathered in the streets. The reaction was a complex mix: sorrow, relief, anxiety. Their king was dead, a king they hardly knew, one who had drained them yet spent little time among them. John was in Brittany when he heard the news. He immediately sprang into action, buying allies, securing castles, and claiming the throne. Arthur's supporters were also on the move. The succession crisis Richard had feared was unfolding, just as he might have foreseen, had he ever taken the time to foresee it. Richard's body was divided, his heart sent to ruin, his entrails buried in chalice, and his body laid to rest beside his father at Fontevraud Abbey. Even in death, he remained fragmented, unable to belong wholly to any one place. This symbolic division foreshadowed the fate of his empire. John became king, but his reign was unstable from the very beginning. He lacked Richard's military prowess, Richard's reputation, and Richard's luck. To make matters worse, he inherited the problems left by Richard: an empty treasury, an exhausted populace, a greedy Philip, and distrustful nobles. In 1204, Normandy fell. Sage Fateau Gaillard, Richard's beautiful daughter, surrendered after a 6-month siege. Richard had claimed it was impregnable, but Richard was gone. Philip's engineers found a weakness, not in the defenses Richard designed, but in a place Richard had never anticipated. Even the most perfect castle requires people to defend it, supplies to sustain it, and reinforcements to support it. By 1214, the Plantagenet Empire had lost nearly all of its territories in France. A century and a half of construction vanished within 15 years of Richard's death. Historians may debate whether this was inevitable, but the outcome is certain: the legacy Richard built, sustained by force while he could fight, could not be maintained after his death. But another legacy was taking root. Bards began to sing tales of Richard, each retelling slightly embellished. The victory at Arsuf grew more glorious, the enemy more numerous, Richard more valiant. The heroism at Jaffa was magnified. 80 knights became 50, then 20, until Richard was nearly single-handedly saving the city. Failure is downplayed or reframed. Jerusalem. Richard nearly captured it. Only betrayal stood in the way. Imprisonment. A brave king enduring hardship. Chalice. A tragic yet heroic end. Each generation reshapes the story, discarding inconvenient parts and reinforcing desired themes. By the 13th century, Richard appeared in the legends of Robin Hood, the good king who fought in the Holy Land, while the wicked John usurped his throne. The stories overlook that Richard himself was an absent ruler, whose absence created the vacuum John exploited. But legends do not require complexity. They need heroes and villains. Richard became the hero. In the 14th century, the knightly class regarded Richard as the epitome of chivalry, overlooking his brutality and emphasizing his courage. In the 15th century, poets celebrated his romantic adventures. By the 16th century, writers of Shakespeare's era portrayed him as a symbol of England's glory, despite Richard barely speaking English. During the Victorian era of the 19th century, at the height of the British Empire, Richard became a builder of the empire and a disseminator of civilization. His crusades were depicted as a struggle of civilization against barbarism. A statue was erected in Westminster, London, showcasing Richard's heroic stance with a raised sword. Ironically, the real Richard did little for England. The 20th century brought reflection after the two world wars. Historians began to question the value of military glory. Richard's crusades were re-examined, an early example of cultural conflict, the dangers of religious fanaticism, and the limitations of military solutions. The massacre at Acre could no longer be ignored. Richard's image became complex, sometimes even negative. What do we see in the 21st century? Richard, a complex individual. Both courageous and reckless, gifted, yet fatally flawed, inspiring yet wounding. We witness the cost of absent leadership, the limits of personal charisma, and the distinction between reputation and substance. We see the consequences of choices that echo through the centuries. But what will the next generation see? What questions will they care about? What lessons will they draw from Richard's story? History is not fixed. It is a dialogue. Each generation converses with the past, asking its own questions and seeking its own answers. Richard's story is rich enough to accommodate many interpretations. An arrow shot in 1199, its path spanning 8 centuries. It struck not only Richard's shoulder, but also empires, dynasties, and countless lives. A single moment's choice. Richard's decision to inspect the walls, the crossbowman's decision to fire, altered the course of history. This raises a question that everyone ponders. How many consequences of our choices can we foresee? Richard did not know that arrow would fly, but he created all the conditions that made that moment possible. At Chalus, besieging an insignificant castle, without proper protection, still behaving like a 20-year-old at 41. The patterns of a lifetime converged at that moment. The legacy Richard sought, the recaptured Jerusalem, the mighty empire. He did not obtain the legacy he received, legendary fame. A complex story, enduring lessons. May be more valuable than what he desired. This is not consolation, but observation. History keeps its accounts in strange ways. It is now 2026. Richard has been dead for 827 years. His kingdom has long vanished. His castles mostly lie in ruins, and both his enemies and allies have turned to dust. Yet his story endures, not because it is perfect, but because it is true. Not because it provides answers, but because it raises questions. Not because Richard succeeded, but because the way he failed teaches us. A king who ruled for a decade, yet spent only 6 months in his kingdom. A warrior who won nearly every battle, but lost the entire war. A legend who built the loudest reputation, yet left behind a crumbling realm. This is Richard, contradictory, complex, profoundly human. His story does not end, As long as people still ponder ambition, duty, legacy, and choice. An arrow echoing for 800 years. The tale continues.